Dr. Walter Rodney. A poem entitled For Walter Rodney by Martin Carter. Assassins of conversation, they bury the voice they assassinate in the beloved grave of the voice, never to be silent. I sit in the presence of rain, in the sky's wild noise, at the feet of some who not only, but also kill the origin of rain, the ankle of the whore, as fastidious as the great fight, the wife of water. Risker, risk, I intended to turn a sky of tears for you.
Every human society has a history and a form of culture, and this includes Africa. Africans in the West have been deliberately kept ignorant of African achievements by the white men for centuries. The purpose of their policy was to build up a picture of a barbarous Africa so that we Africans who had been removed from our homes and made into slaves would be afraid to admit even to ourselves that we were Africans. Africa is the home of mankind. The human being came into existence on the African continent nearly 2 million years ago, and human society and culture reached great heights in Africa before the white men arrived. Certain things were outstanding in the African way of life, whether in a small or large society. These distinctive things in the African way of life amount to African culture. Among the principles of African culture, the following are to be noted: hospitality, respect, especially to elders, importance of the woman, especially in cases of inheritance, humane treatment of lawbreakers, spiritual reflection, common use of the land, constant employment of music, especially drums, and bright colors. Some of these principles are found in many different human societies, but very few are encouraged in the present white capitalist world. Even in Africa itself, European slave trading and colonization have destroyed many aspects of African culture. But culture is not a dead thing, nor does it always remain the same. It belongs to living people and is therefore always developing. If we, the Blacks in the West, accept ourselves as Africans, we can make a contribution to the development of African culture, helping to free it from European imperialism. Probably the most important development in human history was the invention of agriculture. All over the world, the greatest challenge to man was his environment or physical surroundings. Man in Africa learned to overcome the problems of his own environment. Advanced methods of agriculture developed in Africa many hundreds of years before Europeans went to that continent. Irrigation, terracing, crop rotation were all practiced. The other basic aspect of material culture is concerned with the working of metals and the making of metal tools. Apart from the metal aspect of culture, man has always produced things of the spirit. In fact, the development of religion, literature, and art is associated with higher forms of culture and civilization. In all these fields, Africa can be proud of her achievements.
I'm pleased to be able to speak in the name of Walter Rodney at this commemorative event hosted by Moray House Trust. This is what Rodney said. You see, we have had too much of this foolishness of race. I'm not going to attempt to allocate the blame one way or another. I think more than one political party has been responsible for the crisis of race relations in this country. I think our leadership has failed us on that score. I think external intervention was important in bringing the races against each other from the 50s and particularly in the early 60s. But I'm concerned with the present. If we made that mistake once, we cannot afford to be misled on that score today. No ordinary Afro-Guyanese, no ordinary Indo-Guyanese can today afford to be misled by the myth of race. Time and time again, it has been our undoing. Does it have anything to do with race that the cost of living far outstrips the increase in wages? Does it have anything to do with race that there are no goods in the shops? Does it have anything to do with race when the original lack of democracy as exemplified in the national elections is reproduced at level of local government elections? Does it have anything to do with race when the bauxite workers cannot elect their own union leadership? Does it have anything to do with race when day after day, whether one is Indian or African or mixed, without the appropriate party credentials, one either gets no employment, loses one employment, or is subject to lack of promotion? It is clear that we must get beyond that red herring and recognize that it is intended to divide, that it is not intended in the interest of the common African and Indian people in this country. Those who manipulated in the 1960s on both sides were not the sufferers. They were not the losers. The losers were those who participated, who shared blows and who got blows, and they are the losers today. It is time that we understand that those in power are still attempting to maintain us in that mentality, maintain us captive in that mentality where we are afraid to act or we act injudiciously because we believe that our racial interests are at stake. Surely we have to transcend the racial problems. Surely we have to find ways and means of ensuring that there is racial justice in this society. Because, as I said before, you start with one thing, you end with another. The system doesn't stop at racial discrimination because it is a system of class oppression. It only camouflages its class nature under a racial cover. And in the end, it will move against anyone, irrespective of color. In the end, they will move even against their own. Because don't believe, if you're a member of that party today, that you will be protected tomorrow from the injustices. Because when a monster grows, it grows out of control. It eats up even those who created the monster. And it's time that our Guyanese people understood that. What I'm trying to say is simply this. The revolution is made by ordinary people, not by angels. It's made by people from all walks of life, and more particularly by the working class, who are in the majority.
immediately after slavery was abolished, the planters in Guyana were relatively well off. So, although we are speaking about a certain degree of decline in the sugar industry in the Caribbean in the 19th century, the Guyana planters were better off. First of all, they had more slaves and they got more compensation money as a result out of the $20 million that the British gave to compensate the slave owners. Secondly, they had new land, very important in that type of system of production, which is wasteful of the land. Places like St. Kitts or Barbados had already experienced land exhaustion. In Guyana, there was new land. Thirdly, the Guyana plantations were not yet in debt in the way that the old plantation system in the Caribbean had fallen into debt. Indeed, Guyana was always free subsequently of that pattern of debt in which there were 3 or 4 mortgages and liens and so on against plantations. The Guyana planters did not have to use their money to pay off debts, as was true of some other planters. Consequently, they had some capital in hand and were able to keep the plantation system alive. To keep the system alive required, however, more than capital. Indeed, I would argue that capital is of less importance than having a labor supply of a particular type. That is the crucial characteristic, labor of a particular type. The labor must be cheap and plentiful, and even more important, the labor must be easily controlled. Unless labor can be provided under conditions that maximize the industrial control, you cannot have a functioning plantation system. I think that aspect of the situation has been obscured in the discussion, so that it appears as though the question was whether there was a sufficient supply of labor or whether labor would be amendable to certain rates of pay. In fact, the real question was whether the ex-slave, the freed slaves, could create a new way of life in which labor enters a relationship with capital under conditions that are at least partially determined by labor, whether labor could free itself from some of the absolute controls characteristic of slavery. It is that issue that was resolved to the advantage of the planters and to the detriment of the ex-slaves in the years after emancipation. In 1838, the legal era of apprenticeship came to an end and Africans were freed. The traditional interpretation is that this Black labor force then skipped off the plantation. The evidence which is there, the moment one begins to look at it, is that the African people continued to work. In many senses, they even intensified certain aspects of their work on the plantation, but they did so under conditions in which they now had and began to put into practice an alternative vision about the organization of work, about their culture, about their politics, and about what they expected in society. It was a vision that they could not articulate under slavery. And this is where they came into conflict with the plantation system. At ex-slaves, when they moved onto the land, acquired household plots of land, garden plots, which did not in any way make them into peasantry. They were nowhere close to being dependent on the land or to exercising their labor on the land so as to make a livelihood. Most of the individuals called peasants in Guyanese historiography were in fact part-time workers. For the most part, they were indeed workers on the sugar estates, and they merely turned to the land for a certain amount of subsistence for their families. They might have had half an acre, sometimes no more than a quarter of an acre, sometimes no more than the house lot, and a small portion of land attached to it.
Walter Rodney understood from early in life that messaging was important. Understanding one's history and applying it to the present was crucial. From being immersed in politics by his parents as a child, to honing his debating skills in high school, to Hyde Park in London, he began to ground with his brothers and sisters. History is a powerful tool, and Rodney used it well to help educate, heal, and empower people. This drew the ire of governments wherever he sojourned. Targeted by security forces in the US, Europe, and the UK, banned in Jamaica, and finally the attempt to silence him forever in his homeland Guyana on June 13th, 1980. Daddy understood that a nation's future could be changed for the better of all its people through its children, and he began to write a series about the people who came to Guyana and the indigenous peoples in order to address racial tensions and divisions. Daddy explained that the aim of the series was to make a modest contribution to revealing further aspects of a rich and varied heritage so the children at least could better understand themselves and each other. Kofi Badu Out of Africa by Walter Rodney. He, Kofi Badu, a grown man of 40, a father of 15 children, a widely traveled trader, a compound elder, and respected counsel in his home village, could hardly believe that this was happening to him. He was being exposed to the kind of humiliation unfit even for a boy who had not yet been initiated. Against his will, tears came to his eyes. Kofi Badu, born a free person of Ashanti, was now a slave. Kofi's father and his father before him had been traders. The Akan handed down skills within the family. So it was only logical that Kofi too would become a trader. Trading was a dignified and respected profession. Of course, there was profit to be made, but cheating was not accepted. In essence, trading was by barter, with the Akan and most other Africans exchanging one commodity directly for another. Having started at 14, Kofi stuck to the trading life for 26 years before he was captured and enslaved. During this time, he developed the virtues of courage and patience, tolerance and independence, modesty and open-mindedness. By standards of his time, Kofi Badu was a man of culture. Indeed, by any standards, trading in West Africa was a cultured profession. A trader had to know several languages. Kofi himself knew the languages of the Gonja and Mossi nations, and he was almost as fluent in the Malinke and Arabic languages. They were also about to become statistics. Kofi Badu himself would become yet another slave shipped from the Guinea coast across the Middle Passage to the Caribbean in the year 1698. He would be one of the many millions raped from Africa since the year 1447. And this horrendous trade in human beings was to last until the 1860s. Each slave was a chattel, a word with the same origins as cattle. Kofi Badu, with his shining black skin, sloping forehead, and broad shoulders, was just another chattel. And yet, he was a man.
On the evening of June 23, 1980, Walter Rodney was buried at the age of 38. It was a people's funeral. Earlier in the day, thousands of Guyanese had walked over a distance of 12 miles behind the murdered body of this young historian. He was not the first victim of political murder in Guyana, but the radical nature of his commitment as a teacher and activist, the startling promise that his life symbolized, made of his death something of a novel tragedy. Directive had gone out to government employees that they should avoid this occasion. Yet no one could recall in the entire history of the country so large and faithful a gathering assembled to reflect on the horror that had been inflicted on the nation. The Caribbean had been deprived of a great creative mind, but Walter Rodney had achieved at an early age the special distinction of being a permanent part of a unique tradition of intellectual leadership among Africans and people of African descent in the Americas. He belongs to the same order of importance as Marcus Garvey and W.E.B. Du Bois, George Padmore, and C.L.R. James. Products of various doctrines of imperialism, they had initiated through the work as writers and orators of distinction a profound reversal of values. It is not possible to have a comprehensive view of all the ramifications of Africa's encounter with Europe without reference to these men. Walter Rodney consolidated and extended that work. His scholarship was sure, and it was also a committed and partisan scholarship. He believed that history was a way of ordering knowledge which could become an active part of the consciousness of an uncertified mass of ordinary people, and which could be used by all as an instrument of social change. He taught from that assumption. He wrote out of that conviction, and it seemed to have been the informing influence on his relations with the organized working people of Guyana. Rodney begins this inquiry some 2 centuries after the introduction of slave labor and about 50 years after the formal emancipation. It is not just a casual reminder that this coastal strip of Guyana was hazardous terrain. He situates men and women in nature, at once elaborate and precise in defining the categories of capital and labor. But first, he plunges us into the sodden realities of mud and feces, the menace of flood, either from the sea or from overwhelming torrents of rain. Dutch agricultural engineering had devised a way of reclaiming the land, and African labor had found in the concept of the polder a means of digging and draining while setting up a structure of dams that would offer some defense against the sea and other threats of flood. It was a stupendous effort by labor to make the land suitable for cultivation of sugarcane, and the maintenance of the polder would be a continuing anxiety. The Venn Commission of 1948 estimated that each square mile of cane cultivation involved the provision of 49 miles of drainage canals and ditches and 16 miles of higher level of waterways used for transformation and irrigation. The commissioners noted that the construction of these waterways must have entailed the moving of at least 100 million tons of soil. This meant that slaves moved 100 million tons of heavy, waterlogged clay with shovel in hand, while enduring conditions of perpetual mud and water. Working people continued making a tremendous contribution to the humanization of the Guyanese coastal landscape. It is the operative word, humanization, that confirms his real intention. Such an emphasis leads to an overwhelming conclusion. The history of humanizing this landscape is primarily the history of those hands. Retelling this history was the task Rodney had set for himself over 2 volumes, the first of which must now be the last.
Lakshmi out of India. What would you guess to be the meaning of the term number 314X Clarence 1865? Strange as it may sound, it actually refers to a person, to a young Indian woman who came to Guyana to work as an indentured laborer on one of the sugar estates. Lakshmi was born on the plains of northern India. Lakshmi was a Kurmi. She was from an agricultural caste forming part of the productive basis of Indian civilization. The peasants were the ones who provided the support of a huge pyramid of agriculture, commerce, and industry. They also contributed to the culture of India with inventiveness and a sense of color and balance. This pattern was very striking in music, dance, and drama in northern and southern India. Lakshmi herself was another symbol. She was a woman of India, a child of the Indian peasantry. The peasant women of India displayed an inexhaustible patience and a remarkable capacity to make something out of nothing. With Lakshmi, this determined spirit was soon revived and was afterwards to account for her decision to voyage to Demerara. Once the suggestion of immigration was put into Lakshmi's mind, it seemed to grow bigger and bigger until she acted on it. The simple fact was that as an orphan without a family, she had very poor prospects in the family-conscious Indian society. Just at that time, the recruiters were very active. They said that if she went to the immigration office in Calcutta, she would be sent off to Demerara to work for a big wage. In the port of Calcutta, she saw what they called the Kuli immigrant ships floating in the harbor, and she wondered whether she had better stick to the evils which she knew. But when Lakshmi suggested that she might change her mind about emigrating, the recruiters turned very nasty. What eventually made up Lakshmi's mind was meeting Persaud. Persaud was originally from Uttar Pradesh, and he had already signed up at the Calcutta immigration office to go to Demerara. They were married right there in the immigration office. Not that it was a case of love at first sight. It was nothing as romantic as that. Lakshmi was being quite practical in consenting to a marriage of convenience before undertaking the voyage to the unknown, the voyage to Demerara as number 314X Clarence, 1865.
Every piece of scholarship is implicitly and explicitly a review of previous work on a given subject. But from time to time, it is also illuminating to direct attention specifically to the nature of existing studies on a particular theme. Historians often resort to this approach as part of a tradition of assessing the scope and limitations of their own discipline. When this is done, the problem that immediately arises is one of categorization. Into what slot can this or that writer be fitted as a basis for further discussion? Not surprisingly, for the historian, the answer is often to make use of a chronological scale. Assuming that the discussion concerns a set of events that took place at least a century or two ago, then it is a relatively simple matter to follow changing patterns of interpretation, starting with contemporaries of the events and moving towards the present. However, when the events are close to the present, a more synchronic approach is unavoidable. This is the situation with regard to the Russian Revolution. The rise of states governed by Marxism sharpened the contradictions between socialist and bourgeois ideologies, producing an ideological war for the possession of the whole world. The writing of history has been a facet of and a weapon in that war, and historians interpreting the Russian Revolution itself have been active combatants. The bourgeois view has the following characteristics. One, claims to be concerned with humanity rather than a given class. Two, high level of subjectivism. And three, refuses to recognize contradictions except at a superficial level. As an example of the first, one can take the work of English historian Hugh Seton Watson of Oxford, one of the leading English historians of Russia and communist Europe. Seton Watson is solidly in the bourgeois camp, as seen when he refers skeptically to communism as a theory which professes to explain philosophy, religion, history, economics, and society. He then goes on to say bluntly that, and I quote, communism is a science of conspiracy, a technique of wrecking and subversion. While decrying the Bolsheviks for crushing democracy, he constantly makes statements such as the simple and guileless workers and peasants, the politically ignorant and gullible masses, the simple peasants. Another bourgeois approach that is quite effective is the subjectivist one, which does not start by examining reality as it exists, but rather puts forward for the reader a set of evocative images that come from his own mind. Words such as dictatorship, terror, and even communist are used to convey the required impressions. This carries history into the realm of narcotic drugs. Such historians really taking one on a trip.